So far, we've covered how to create most materials for our models and texture them, add UV coordinates and so on. In this video, we're going to explore another type of textures, procedural textures. The reason behind the name is that they are generated by a mathematical function, and some of them exist not only in the UV space, but also in 3D space, so they can work without UV coordinates. And they are also highly customizable. Let's select the cream geometry and go to its material. The cream is perfect for a procedural material as it is a very complex shape that isn't worth UV unwrapping. Right now, it has a basic shader with default settings, and from the references, we see that cream has some very fine waves, visible mostly in the highlights, and also small holes that come with the air bubbles. Let's start with a noise texture, set its coordinates to object, that way we make sure the noise isn't stretched in some direction, and see what we can tweak. Scale will dictate how big the splotches of the noise are. The details will dictate how many fractal levels will be in the noise, and the roughness breaks up the noise splotches into smaller ones. Try to find a good blend between these three settings to match the reference. My hint would be to test out higher values to match the high frequency detail in the cream. Once we like the noise texture, we can plug it into a bump node attached to the material and dial down the distance, until we get the subtle effect we want. For the tiny holes, we can use another procedural called Voronoi. Don't forget to set the mapping to object again. If we preview the Voronoi, it already looks like gradient cells, which is perfect. We just need to adjust their size. The scale parameter helps, but we still need to isolate just a few holes instead of having the whole thing covered. For that, we can bring up the contrast of the texture using a curve node. Just make sure to really squeeze the whites. If you find it easier, you can do the same thing with a gradient ramp node and just bring in the white slider to the left and the black one just slightly nudge it to the right. It does the same thing. From here, we can try blending the textures by using a color mix node before we feed them into the bump. Trying different blending modes and blending amounts can help, but I'd like a more controlled method. Add another bump node and connect it to the already existing one like this. Then plug in the edited Voronoi texture in the height and dial down the distance. Now that we've set up the right textures for this material, we can give it a nice, dark chocolatey color and make it a bit shinier than the default setting. Also, cream has a subsurface component to it, but you already know how to set that up. Just remember that a warm scatter color looks better. To sum up, we explored how to work with procedural textures and match complex surface imperfections in an easy and controlled way. In the next lesson, we're going to wrap up the syrup topping shader. Also, if you have skipped some of the previous steps but wish to follow along from here, you can get all the project files for this tutorial series from the link in the description below. I'll also be adding some bonus videos in there if anyone wants to speed up their learning process. Subscribe for more tutorials and see you in the next episode.